Please stand for the reading of Genesis. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For it is through Isaac that your offspring shall be named for you. And for the son of the slave woman, I will make him a great nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning, took bread and a skin of water, and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water of the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And she sat opposite him. She lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes and saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife from him for the land of Egypt. The word of the Lord. You may be seated.
You've probably heard of the famous Old Testament couple, Abraham and Sarah. Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 91 years old when they gave birth to their son Isaac, who is said to be the promise of a great nation, having many descendants come from him. But today's reading is not really about Abraham and Sarah, at least not directly. It's about their slave, Hagar, a woman who really meant nothing to the people of the time. She had no money, no status. She was a slave. She was treated as property, much like a person would treat a toaster oven or a family pet. We first meet Hagar back in Genesis 16. This is before the birth of Isaac to Abraham and Sarah. God had promised Abraham a great nation with many descendants, but Abraham and Sarah had no children. So they decided to take matters into their own hands. And Sarah came up with a plan for Abraham to get together with Hagar and conceive a child. And of course, Abraham was all in for it. He was fine with that. So a la Handmaid's Tale kind of things, Hagar becomes pregnant with Abraham's child. Well, naturally, Sarah begins to have great resentment of Hagar, who's able to have this child as she becomes pregnant. And Hagar senses this. She's being treated harshly, and she wants to get out of there. She wants to flee into the wilderness. And remember now, the wilderness is 200 miles of desert, because between where Abraham and Sarah live, and Egypt, where Hagar is from, where she wants to return, 200 miles of wilderness. So she flees out into the wilderness. She's pregnant. She's alone. She feels defeated. She's running out of hope. And it's here that the angel of the Lord finds her, searches her out. Hagar didn't call on the Lord. Hagar didn't ask for the angel to come. But it's God who searches out Hagar and comes to her in the wilderness. And the angel says to Hagar, "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" And Hagar says, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarah." And the angel said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." But the angel also gives Hagar this promise: "I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they shall be too numerous to count." Now, this is a powerful thing that happens here. First of all, an angel of the Lord comes to Hagar in the wilderness. And it's a sign, really, that God is constantly searching us out and finding us in the midst of our wilderness experiences. When we feel like running, as we so often do at different times, when we feel alone or defeated or hopeless, God is searching for you and me. And Hagar knows that God is with her because this angel comes to her. Now, normally when we think of angels, we think of heavenly creatures with wings. But that's not how they're described in the Bible. An angel is simply a messenger, someone who delivers God's hope and encouragement and helps people. An angel is a messenger of God. And what's even more interesting here is that we'll see in a moment how this angel is actually God that comes to Hagar. And the message that this angel gives to Hagar is not one that she necessarily wants to hear. She's hoping that the angel of the Lord will tell her something like, "Everything will be fine. God will take care of it. Don't worry." But that's not the message that Hagar receives. Instead, the angel tells her to return home and submit to Sarah. Indeed, it is not a message that she wants to hear. And so, I find this interesting in our own lives as well, because so often when we're in the wilderness, when we have those experiences, we just want God to fix it all, right? To take it all away magically and not have to go through it. But that's not the way that God is working here, and it seems to work so often. But God promises to walk with us through the wilderness and give us hope. The angel doesn't tell Hagar that everything will be fixed. The angel tells her that she has to go back. And so where does Hagar find that strength and that courage and endurance to go back? She finds it in God's promise, that God promises to see her and to be with her. And she finds it in the hope that God gives her of the promise that her offspring will have a great nation. Things will get better. There is a future hope, and that enables Hagar to return back. But first, Hagar names God. And this is very interesting. You know, in the Old Testament, people don't name God. God comes up with names for God's self. I am who I am. People don't name God, but yet here, Hagar becomes the first person, and she's a woman. She's a slave. She's a foreigner. She's an outsider. She becomes the first person to name God. And she names God El Roi, the God who sees, because she knows that God has seen her in her wilderness, and promised to be with her. And God does the same for you. When you feel that you are in your wilderness, when you feel rejected and pushed out and pushed away, when you felt like you've been dealt with harshly, you may feel invisible like Hagar did, but know that God sees you. So Hagar goes back to Abraham and Sarah, and no doubt Sarah continues to mistreat her. And Hagar does give birth to a child, and she names the child Ishmael, which, interesting enough, means God hears. So now we know that not only does God see, but God hears. And that tension and animosity between Sarah and Hagar continue, until finally Abraham and Sarah have their own child, Isaac. And guess now what happens to Hagar and Ishmael? There's no use for them anymore. So now Sarah says to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for this son of the slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." And this is very distressing to Abraham. So he does what Sarah says, and he sends Hagar and Ishmael out anyway. He gives them some bread and a skin of water and says, "Go, God be with you." And that's it. Abraham gives them some bread and a skin of water. That's Abraham's child support. This definitely is not one of Abraham's finest hours. Father of faith, right? And in fact, we find out that this is the very first divorce that happens in the Bible, because Abraham had actually married Hagar, and now she's sending her and her child away with just a bread and a skin of water. This event is captured in many pieces of art. Here's one for you that's called The Expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. You can see Sarah behind Abraham's, looking over Abraham's right shoulder there. Another picture here shows the two out in the wilderness. And we see in the desert that Ishmael is looking faint. And look at the look on Hagar's face. I mean, that's the wilderness for you. That's a face that shows there's no hope. There's all kinds of ways that we experience the wilderness in our lives. One kind of wilderness that people go through, that actually Abraham and Hagar went through, is the wilderness of divorce. In a video from the Church of Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas, people share their wilderness experience of divorce. Let's take a look.
From the outside looking in, we were the perfect family. My husband had a successful career, and we had a beautiful home, and we were living our dream. But then, after 20 years of marriage, my husband moved on to another woman, and I was left with the broken pieces of my family in a very public divorce. I remember those bleak days of fog and tears, of crying out to God and wondering why I couldn't be enough for my husband.
When my wife left, I begged, I pleaded, I searched desperately for reasons why, and promised that I would be a better husband, a better father. It was the worst thing I've gone through in my life. I would sink into the darkest of depressions. Drinking bottles of wine was the norm. Most nights when I didn't have my children, I would drink until I would pass out. I'd wake up the next morning wanting to be a better person, but I couldn't find the strength.
We were married for 10 years. We had 2 children. And when I found out that my husband was leaving me for someone else, I was blindsided and taken totally off guard. I knew this wasn't what God wanted, and I remember crying out to Him to stop this from happening to me.
So we hear from these people, they're crying out to God in pain. You know, why? And God, can't you just fix it? But yet we hear in these people's experience that that's not the way it happens. God doesn't just fix it. And when we see this, we realize our own experience of wilderness. It doesn't necessarily have to be divorce. It could be any type of rejection. Maybe the rejection of a girlfriend or boyfriend, or maybe it's a relationship that goes sour between a parent and child, or maybe it's because of differences in the family over politics or religion, or troubles in relationships with coworkers or longtime friends. Maybe it's experiencing racial differences or differences over sexual orientation and gender identity. It's these experiences of rejection and all wilderness experiences where we can feel invisible, we can feel worthless and in pain. But God tells us that God is always in the midst of our wilderness experience. And as today's Bible reading goes on, we hear now about how Hagar is a long way from home. She is thirsty and hungry along with their son Ishmael. And when the water is gone, she gets to the point where she puts Ishmael under the bushes and goes off from him. And the child cries out, and as she sits opposite from him, she begins to weep. Do you feel her pain? The hopelessness and despair that she is feeling? Here's another picture of that. But here's what happens next. Once more, she's in the wilderness by herself. Or at least she thinks she's by herself. And this is what we read. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of the God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of your boy." Remember, the boy is Ishmael, and Ishmael means God hears. God has heard the voice of the boy. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make of him a great nation. And there is that promise again of making a great nation through Ishmael, a promise for a better future, for hope. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up in the wilderness. Once more, God comes to Hagar in her wilderness. And once more, God sees her and hears her and gives her a word of hope. God guides her to the well, which is just around the corner. God provides her with just enough water to drink. And that's all she needs to sustain her one more day. And God does the same for you in whatever wilderness you may be facing. God searches you out. God comes to you, and God says to you, "I see you. I hear you." And God provides God's angels to help you, to get you to that water that you need just to keep going, that may be right around the corner that you cannot see. And then God sends his angels, his messengers, to help you. What do those angels look like? We learn that angels are actually messengers, people who bring words of encouragement and hope, people who find water for thirsty people. You know what those angels look like? Those angels look like people like you. That's what those angels look like. They look like people who see who God sees, people who hear who God hears, people who are willing to help one another. In these videos that we saw of people sharing their stories of the wilderness of divorce, they indeed found that God had found them and seen them and heard them and sent God's angels to help them. Let's take a listen of what happens.
From the outside looking in, we were the perfect family. My husband had a successful career.
My stretcher bearers were the amazing women in my life who had known me forever. My mother and sisters listened with compassion as I cried out about my crushed dreams, and then gently but firmly told me that I must now change my dreams and look to God for His plan for my life.
I was mad at God, pleading for a miracle. I begged for signs from God. One day, it hit me. The signs are all around you. I just needed to open my eyes to see signs of His love all around. My friends, my boss, my kids, the beauty of the fall leaves. I began to look at life differently. Somehow, some way, God brought me back.
I was laying in bed crying hysterically. It was at bedtime and I was hurting so bad. I kept asking, why? Why would you do this to me? Why? And then I heard a voice say, and I quote, "I'm not doing this to you, I'm doing this for you." I stopped crying because at that moment I heard Him and trusted Him. My husband was abusive to me at times, to me and my son, but I put every ounce of trust I had in our Lord, and I followed. To this day, I give Him praise for saving me and my son.
God was at work in my wilderness in many ways. There were two families who were only acquaintances who showed me love and support. They watched my children, they brought food, called me, and took my calls when I needed someone to talk to. Although we went through many dark days with love, support, and encouragement from family and friends, and a solid church home, we found happiness again.
Did you hear how God saw and heard these people in the midst of their experience of divorce? Sure, it was through ways in which they sensed God's presence, but it was also because of God's messengers, of people coming alongside to help them. Word of peace, I want you to be a church like that. I want you to see the people who God sees, to hear the people who God hears, to be God's angels, God's messengers, to come alongside people and help them to discover that water that's just around the corner that they cannot see. You are God's messengers that come alongside people and help them. God is El Roy, the God who sees, and God is Ishmael, the God who hears. And God sends His angels, His messengers, people just like you, to come alongside and help one another. This is how we make it through the wilderness. May we pray, and as we do, I invite you to repeat after me. God, thank you for seeing me. Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for your constant presence with me. Lord, help me to see your people who are hurting and use me to bless them. Amen.